We're really happy to be here with Dr. Katharine McNamara. She is our 2025 Outstanding Dissertation Award for Marianne Schmink Outstanding Dissertation Award. And her research was selected as for being transformative in terms of bridging theory and practice, and also in terms of being like interdisciplinary, bridging many concepts from many disciplines. So we better start it.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I'm really excited to be here because this is the first publication that has come out of my dissertation. It was just published December 2025 about multi-species solidarity and medicinal plant economies. So I started my research during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as many of us, all of us very clearly remember, it was just an unprecedented time for human health, right? And as a researcher in the field of public health, starting out, I also realized, and as did many other researchers around the same time, that it was also an unprecedented moment for environmental health. So we saw in some cases species and ecosystems flourishing as people left areas, and amid human absence, other species started coming back into areas that they were previously left. But then we also saw other examples where species experienced increased extractive pressure due to their importance in human livelihoods and health practices. And in the context where I was doing my research in Ecuador, one species really stood out in terms of the kinds of impacts it was experiencing. And that was Cinchona officinalis, or cascarilla as it's known locally. Now, cascarilla is a member of the family Rubaceae, so the same family as coffee. It's got those shiny green leaves, and it's a bit of a shrubby looking plant, not very impressive, but it has a very impressive history. So it is a natural source of quinine, and it was the first source of quinine to be heavily extracted at an international level. It figured within international and imperial agendas for public health promotion, and it was really the first botanical species to be featured in that way as a method of implementing mass public health schemes. So quinine is used to treat malaria, among some other diseases, including rheumatoid arthritis and some autoimmune disorders. But at the time when Cinchona officinalis was first discovered in Loja, it became the primary way that the Spanish Empire sought to control malaria outbreaks in tropical areas that it hoped to control, so Latin America. And then among other European empires, it became the object of desire because it was a tool that could be used to control malaria in Southeast Asia and Africa. So really this opened up in so many different ways colonization of the tropics. And in Loja, since it was a site where Cinchona officinalis, kind of official Cinchona, as acknowledged by the Spanish Empire, was identified, it was extracted to near extinction between 1712 until 1835. And we still see the impacts of this colonial era extraction today. Cascarilla continues to be extremely scarce and has never quite recovered from colonial era extraction. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, the research question that I was using to guide this chapter of my dissertation was, how do dynamics of care and extraction figure within the construct of multi-species solidarity? And I came to this question because I was observing people extracting cascarilla heavily during the COVID-19 pandemic, adapting their local knowledge to a disease threat, and then as a consequence of that, extracting it once again to near extinction. But at the same time, cascarilla was also an instrument of care that local health practitioners used to provide services to people in their community, and that also people used as a method of exchange to sustain community bonds during lockdown. So both of these features, extraction and care, figure very strongly within local relationships with the plant. And before I get too deep into the research, we often think about solidarity as a human construct, as something that we leverage to build bonds between ourselves and maybe a vulnerable community. But it's also a multi-species concept. And so I use this definition from more humanist literature in my application of the construct of multi-species solidarity. So the biggest thing to remember throughout the presentation is that solidarity has two components. One is this emotional relational bond that we attach to vulnerable others, whether that's a group of people or whether that's a vulnerable species, and that this kind of emotional bond is then translated in some kind of action, a sense of responsibility that motivates a change. And we see these discourses around solidarity in conservation spaces, in calls to action that evoke human connections to nature, that evoke our relationship to other species, or that humanize other species. And there are some, especially charismatic megafauna, that are particularly effective at getting those emotional reactions and motivating people to action. But we also see notions of solidarity in public health spaces. So one of the things that I wanted to do in my research was bring in these ideas of solidarity that we see in conservation, and integrate them within a One Health framework, which generally speaking is this understanding of public health that views human, environmental, and animal health as interconnected. And more we see this One Health framework expanded to include fungi, to include plants, and a broader group of species.
What do you want? What is it?
Turn on the video and then in the window. I mean,
Yeah, the camera, I didn't want to interrupt. Yeah,
they can see it. That's on.
yeah, no, I know. That's why I turned it off, so at least they don't keep looking at it, because I need to change the camera.
Can you check the text? There are two texts.
The what?
They are in the chat. There are two messages.
I checked over there. It's Marianne. Video would make it easier to understand. Leap reading.
Oh,
They can't hear it.
oh.
Okay.
And that's just on to
That's why I didn't want to interrupt. The audio there, I can hear her because I just tested over there.
Can you hear me okay online?
Yes. Okay.
Let's just continue.
Yeah. And you still see her?
We can see the room.
Oh, I
there
just.
she is. Yes, we can see her now.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so my research was broken down into 3 case studies for this chapter. I first looked at informal pescaria economies with local healers, and this involved interviews and transect walks with health practitioners who use local knowledge and medicinal species in their healing practices. And I use the word informal economies because the majority of the people that I spoke with were not registered practitioners, even though Ecuador recognizes this kind of pluriversal approach to health. Oftentimes the people who practice local medicine fall outside of these formal networks and therefore need to be invited into formal spaces of healthcare practice. So they deal with they navigate very, very carefully these bounds of formal health practice and informal health practice. I also worked with informal economies, with tonic water producers, and conducted interviews with tonic water producers from Toniquina and held informal discussions with producers of cinchona drinks. So there were 2 main tonic water producers in Loja that emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic. The only reason I didn't include cinchona drinks was our schedules did not align during the time that I was in the field. But both were important sources of providing an alternative way of acquiring pescaria that didn't put so much pressure on wild sources of the plant. And then finally, I worked with some people working in the experimental economy with Cascaria nurseries, specifically an organization called Cascaria Ecuador. And that involved interviews and extended participant observation in their greenhouses. Oh, here we are. Okay, so to start off, I already gave you a little bit of the context of local practitioners, but generally speaking, when I say traditional or local practitioners, I'm using them interchangeably. In both contexts, local and traditional health practitioners are really experts in local medicinal and ecological knowledge, and they bring a lot of expertise, especially in context of health crises. So what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic was a lot of these practitioners adapted their pre-existing knowledge of Cascaria to a new disease threat, dealing with COVID-19. And generally speaking, they brought a high degree of respect in the way that they use Cascaria to treat local people, in part because it's viewed as an exceptional medicine. So very, very potent. It can have some not necessarily severe, but definitely uncomfortable health effects. So heart palpitations and like sweating if you consume too much. So they brought that expertise to local practices of consuming the plant. And this was important in the context of Loja, because in this setting, compared to communities that we see in northern Peru, for example, local knowledge is deteriorating at a faster rate. And this is partially the product of the kind of colonization that took place in Loja and the type of the way that indigenous communities were pushed out in search of other livelihoods after colonization as well, with the fall of textile industries. That's a discussion for another time. But the point was that during COVID-19, local health practitioners came back, adapted this knowledge, and also played a critical role in regenerating some of the knowledge that we lost about the plant. Another crucial component of solidarities with traditional healing was their ability to generate and sustain communities during lockdown. So a crucial way that Andean communities sustain relationships with one another is through practices of giving care and reciprocity. During lockdown, those traditional avenues of performing acts of care in person were no longer accessible, and so people turned to exchanging gifts of Cascaria or providing or connecting people to local health care practitioners to receive treatments based in Cascaria as a way of sustaining bonds amid isolation. So traditional healthcare practitioners played a crucial role in that. And we see this quote from Julia, who was one of my main key informants during this time, that, you know, these health skills are so necessary for the community, so we come together by following the Cascaria, you could say. That was what we needed to survive. That was what we needed to survive this, but coming together was it. So really, Cascaria became a way of sustaining human networks of care, as well as sustaining those knowledge networks. And then finally, because of the local ecological knowledge that practitioners bring into this space, many of them came into this space of healing with Cascaria with a conservation mindset. So they thought about using as little of the bark as possible to treat their patients. And Julia also added on this, that we traditional practitioners are used to working with finite resources. We don't go to the pharmacy and ask for more, because eventually there won't be any more. So the second case study I'll turn to is solidarity within the tonic water brewing sector. And here I'm focusing on the case of Toniquina. For a bit of context, Toniquina emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic in response to impacts felt within the craft beer sector. Craft breweries, by definition, are meant to represent only 1% of the national market. And if you exceed that amount, then you're no longer considered a craft brewer in Ecuador. And during the pandemic, they experienced an 80 to 90% decline in their sales in the first 2 months of the pandemic. So this was a massive hit to local livelihoods and people who were dependent on this for sustaining income. In this context, Toniquina developed this idea of using a pre-existing local resource available on their sustainable use reserve to develop an alternative product to beer, which was now heavily restricted under lockdown orders, and then also people were not able to go to breweries because of lockdown. So they shifted their production to producing something that was really already within their ability to produce. They used much of the same equipment. All of the Toniquina was able to be produced from their sustainable use reserve. And then they were also able to share that cascarilla within a broader network of craft brewers under the ASOSERB Association. So ASOSERB is the National Brewing Association of Ecuador, and it has 255 member brewers, I think, right now. And Toniquina, the owners of Toniquina, made the decision to license their product under the ASOSERB label, making this publicly available. So what this means in the context of solidarity is that brewers used a pre-existing entrepreneurial network to leverage human-to-human solidarities that eventually led to opportunities for reducing the consumption pressure of cascarilla on wild trees. And to quote one of the key informants from Toniquina, they see that all of the breweries were struggling, and cascarilla was a resource we had plenty of and had to share. And this really cues into the ability of these kinds of alternative cascarilla-based products to build community. So leveraging that pre-existing network of ASOSERB, which the company also did by donating Toniquina to frontline health workers. Yes, okay, and then the final case study, how am I doing on time? Okay. And then the final case study was of solidarity within the experimental cascarilla businesses of cascarilla nurseries. And this was, so this case is also a little bit different to the previous two because it was started by a local researcher with research funds. It was a seed grant that was awarded by a university with the purpose of seeing, can we grow cascarilla outside of its native habitat? Because that has been a continuing issue with Cinchona officinalis. So while other species of Cinchona, because there are over 30 other species, they can be grown outside of their native habitat. And now we see plantations of Cinchona cubensis throughout Kenya, in Indonesia, and this is what sustains the international quinine economy. But at a local scale, talking specifically about officinalis, the success has not been really great. So a local researcher acquired a seed fund to grow cascarilla in greenhouses, and that's where I did the majority of my participant observation. And this was established before the pandemic, but during COVID-19, the project gained new significance and conservation interest. And what is kind of different about this initiative compared to the other two is that it had an explicit conservation agenda tied to it. And the two components of solidarity that we see emerging in this case was its focus on awareness raising and education. Part of this was getting the word out there that cascarilla was in danger yet again due to over-extraction due to COVID. And then the other component was concienciación.
Awareness.
That is awareness. Okay. About misinformation tied to the appropriate use of cascarilla during COVID-19. And then the second component of solidarities within the nurseries was this explicit commitment to ex situ conservation. The goal of this organization, Cascarilla Ecuador, was to put a cascarilla tree in every garden in Loja, and its mission was to contribute to the conservation of cascarilla and its medicinal use through responsible use and education. So from these three, okay, so let's return to my research question. So looking across these 3 case studies, I wanted to find out how do dynamics of care and extraction figure within the construct of multi-species solidarity. So I went across these 3 case studies, and grouped solidarities within 2 categories: solidarity through Cascadia and solidarity with Cascadia. And I grouped them in this way not to create distinct categories that live in isolation, but rather to provide a way of seeing the different patterns and dynamics that are working within the Cascadia economy and through which many different kinds of solidarities emerge. And I did this in part because oftentimes we associate extraction, harvest, consumption of a natural resource as a negative thing for the plants, especially when we're talking about a protected species like Cascadia. But what I found through developing this categorization is that we see that instances of solidarity through are connected and ripple out to impact solidarity with. So I developed these 2 definitions. Solidarity through Cascadia includes instances where Cascadia is an instrument of human-to-human solidarity, for example, as a source of livelihood in local health practices and in efforts to sustain community relationships. In some cases, these interactions involve harvest and consumption of Cascadia, yet yield net positive dynamics by sustaining local knowledge, awareness, and shifting pressure from wild trees to more sustainable sources. So thinking back to those case studies, this could be in the healthcare provider who delivers services using Cascadia to a local community member, and in doing so, regenerate some local knowledge and awareness of the species and the challenges that it's facing. Can also mean, engendering this general respect for the plant in the broader community, but that can also be through livelihood activities, thinking about the Toniquina project. And although the main motivation of that business is to generate a profit, it is to support livelihoods, it had this broader rippling effect that supported trees by alleviating some of the pressure on wild plants and moving it into a sustainable use forest reserve that can be protected and managed. And then the second component of solidarity was solidarity with, and this includes instances where the intrinsic value of Cascadia motivates human-to-plant solidarity. For example, as an integral component of local history, identity, and more than human communities. And these efforts often have an explicit conservation agenda, but can be challenging to sustain and finance for new and local entrepreneurs. And the point that I want to leave you all with for these 3 case studies is that both solidarity through and with are tied to practices of care. And thinking about the context of public health, these practices and solidarities enable more than human communities to navigate diverse pressures, including extraction and livelihood loss that can come with disease crises. So as I'm thinking about the future directions of this research and how I want to use it to connect with conservation practitioners and others, I started to think about the kinds of opportunities and challenges we face in promoting multi-species solidarity through entrepreneurship. On one hand, entrepreneurs can act as educators, both in a scientific sense, as we see in Cascadia, Ecuador, and then also through local knowledge, as we see with local health practitioners. They can provide essential goods and health services, which is particularly important during health crises, as still 80% of the world will turn to medicinal plants as their first line of treatment during a health crisis to deal with anything from the common cold to COVID-19 and emerging diseases. So provisioning these local essential goods becomes a way of dealing with biomedical uncertainty when we're not sure at a global level how to handle a health crisis. They also provide, entrepreneurs can act as livelihood sources, as in the case of Toniquina, and they can generate funds and interest in conservation and connect human and non-human communities. And we see other examples of multi-species solidarity taking place in entrepreneurship. So one example is game farms in South Africa, that raise conservation awareness and anti-poaching efforts, and then also in sustainable use forest reserves that can provide sustainable livelihoods. On the other hand, there are still challenges associated with these, with medicinal plant economies. The main barrier to leveraging medicinal economies to support solidarity is that socioeconomic inequalities can really present a barrier in terms of limiting the success of entrepreneurship. And something that I go into depth in the paper in discussing is that entrepreneurs that enter this field with significant resources or scientific expertise often have more success than those who do not. So my local health practitioners who have to navigate this space of formality and informality often come against significant barriers with acquiring cascarilla, even in small quantities, and being able to carry out their business without any kinds of legal repercussions. Also, there is a significant challenge with supporting solidarities through medicinal plant economies in contexts where local medicinal knowledge has eroded, because these areas could be more susceptible to malpractice and misinformation about the potential to use local medicinal plants to treat diseases like COVID-19. Something that I saw particularly in the Cascarilla Ecuador initiative was this bridging between local and scientific knowledge to mitigate much of the misinformation that was coming out about cascarilla as a silver bullet to address COVID-19. But that was not always the case across the board. And then finally, there's always the need to strike a balance between human livelihoods and solidarity with non-human species. Okay, and that is it. Okay.